I'm David Petersen, the creator of Mouseguard, and welcome to Creator Commentary for the second series of Mouseguard, Winter 1152. This episode will cover issue number 2, or chapter 2 when it was collected into a hardcover edition. For this issue, I'll be doing the commentary as audio only, but please feel free to follow along in your copy of the story in either issue form or from the hardcover, as I talk about the behind-the-scenes details, art notes, and my headspace as I go page by page and panel by panel. Also, a fair warning, there will be spoilers if you have not read this or the rest of the Mouseguard series. The outline for this issue is dated as being created in July of 2007. It marks the first issue where I juggled two sets of main characters' exploits in very different locations in the same issue. Liam and Kellanaugh above ground, and Saxon, Kenzie, and Sadie in the tunnels below, known as Darkheather. Cover. The cover for issue 2 features Kellanaugh and Liam close to where we left them at the end of issue 1, but with a bit of a spoiler. Liam is pulled to the surface so he can peer down into that hole too. The backside of the cover shows a painted stone marker indicating that this is the Weasel home Darkheather, or at least implies it has some connection with it. I remember struggling with this image to show the perspective of soil and snow, and to show the strata with the grassy layer in between. The main way I achieved a sense of depth was shading, that the soil stippling gets darker, as does the bits of snow falling down towards us, as they get deeper in the hole. I wished I'd done a better job at getting the scale right here. The snow hardly looks deeper than a mouse, and the grass should have been more pronounced. Inside front cover. Like I mentioned in the commentary for last issue, I'd stopped using chapter or issue titles and just used issue chapter numbers instead. The main text block here to get readers up to speed is a pretty straightforward summary for last issue's events. Now that I see this spot illustration, I think I recall doing all of the inside front cover spot illustrations at the same time, which would have been when I was doing issue 1, as a way to practice inking and coloring winter, snow, and ice scenes, where to use a color hold and where not to. I don't think there is any significance to the imagery of the pine cone to this issue, just that it reads as very seasonal. The Reuben poem, again, is 8 lines long, following an A-B-A-B rhyming pattern. I was in some ways inspired by the poem Stop All the Clocks, Cut Off the Telephone by W.H. Auden. I remember I'd practiced reading the verse aloud to myself as I wrote them, imitating the accent of actor John Hannah, who read the Auden poem in the movie 4 Weddings and a Funeral. This is a poem about the hardships of what it means to be a hero. I think I put it here in the story because I was about to put my characters through the ringer. And while I think I was mainly wanting it to refer to Liam and Kellanaugh, a case could be made that the other trio could just as easily be the subject of this poem. Page 1. I wanted to postpone the reader discovering what happened after the snow gave way at the end of issue 1. So, this is a whole page where nothing happens. Well, nothing but showing several beats of what doesn't look good. The height from which they fell, broken gear, and mice not moving. It also purposely doesn't show the 2 mice above ground or their fates either. I wanted to wait for a page turn for that. Page 2, panel 1. And here we are with Liam just barely hanging on, and Kellanaugh struggling to keep him above ground. I could have tightened up on this panel by getting closer to the characters, but I like the amount of empty space and snow around them. It gives a sense of scale, and it also intensifies the bleak drama I was aiming for in winter. Panel 2. Every so often I make sure to use a panel with no mice in it. Sometimes it's to show some architecture or an object or some piece of nature. I love the way Mike Mignola would cut away from the narrative with panels that enhanced the mood, setting, or pacing in that way. Here I'm not cutting away from the action so much as just showing a non-character close-up of the black axe pulling the exposed root loose, the pock sound effect I also cribbed from the panels of Hellboy. Panel 3. Not entirely sure how the physics are working here, as Kellanaugh was struggling to hold up Liam when anchored by that root. Now he's able to swing the weight of the black axe down in front of him, but let's suspend our disbelief a bit and just see it as a foreshadowing of Liam and that axe later in the series. To help suspend your disbelief a bit, I did try to show the snow starting to slump and fall around where Kellinaw is pressing against it on the edge. And finally, a lettering note for this page. The tails of the word balloons are slightly curved, something that I didn't do at all in fall, and only did a few times in winter issue 1. I think this is the point where I realized that those straight tails were a little too much like sword points or daggers pointed directly at the characters, and that something curved and a little softer would be more pleasing to the eye. I'm not consistent with it yet. In fact, the next page they're back to straight, but I think this is kind of the turning point for those. Page 3. This page is a 180-degree rotation of the previous page's layout. Panel 1. This beat of Liam is meant to save the time of showing him grabbing onto the axe, but also not speeding straight ahead to panel 3 of this page where he's dragged up. I wanted to hold on to some of that suspense. I also wanted to have Liam looking down, acknowledging to the reader that he is concerned about the mice down there. Panel 2. Not sure if I really needed this beat of Kellinaw struggling to pull up Liam's weight, but I do like the added tension of the snow being plowed forward as he pulls and he slips. Panel 3. And finally we get the payoff of Liam being pulled safely to the surface. Now is also a good time to point out that the entire time Liam is in contact with the black axe, not only is it wrapped in cloth, but he is also wearing gloves. He does not touch the axe itself until the epilogue. Panel 4. I made careful sure not to do any bird's eye views in these 2 pages to ensure that the reader, or Liam or Kellinaw, get no hint of what the fates of the other mice at the bottom of the hole are. Having the hole in the foreground, I think added to the want of the reader to turn the page and find out what Liam is voicing concern over. Page 4. This page has an odd panel layout compared to my usual, but as most of my pages, I broke all the panel borders at the 1/3 page marks. In the outline for this issue, this page and the next are described as call down to S, K, and S. Panel 1. While it's subtle, Liam leaning over that hole is causing it to slump in a bit more, and his worries voiced aloud are what I was hoping the reader would be fearing the most. In the background, the wrap around the axe blows away as Kellinaw is in almost the same position he was in the last panel of the previous page. I think I knew the mice weren't going to be going to any cities or encountering mice where keeping the axe a secret was necessary any longer. I may have also just been tired of drawing it bundled up. Panel 2. Another panel to add suspense. Indeed, no mice are moving. This panel beat is a reverse angle to the cover of the issue, and it was done as one of the smallest size panels I ever do. Panels 3 and 4. Call and no answer. How long could I keep the tension going or make the reader think that Saxon, Kenzie, or Sadie were irreparably harmed? Well, these 2 panels were my last try anyhow. Panel 5. Instead of moving right into big movements or speeches, I wanted to show subtle movement. Something easier to do in film than in comics, I think. A tiny eyelid twitch, a bit of sound of breath on an exhale. To show that here, on the page, I showed Kenzie's eye open ever so slightly, and the 3-dot ellipses word balloon to indicate some breath or sound coming from him that are not yet words. Panel 6. A tinier version of the cover again from the same angle, pulled back to the point of Liam and Kellinaw being only silhouettes. Page 5, panels 1 through 3. 5 pages in, and I now feel it safe to have the subterranean mice moving and each reacting to their fall. Saxon and Sadie, who landed face first, shake off and spit out snow, something as a kid growing up in Michigan I know from sledding. I had Kenzie go last, as we'd already just seen him, but also, as the one laying face up, could most easily verbalize to Liam that they were alive. Panel 4. This pulled back cutaway is the first real sense of scale we get for how far apart the groups are from one another. I also wanted to establish that the hole/tunnel is natural looking. It may or may not be a burrow made by some animal, but it certainly isn't an architectural location. Yet. I stippled less in the ray of light coming through the hole as it cuts through the tunnel, but I also used a color hold. That's where I paint the line work itself to be a color something other than black, to help get the sense of light and depth. In the previous panel, I have Saxon grabbing up the remains of his sword hilt and blade fragment. Here, we see him trying to scale the side of the tunnel. Page 6, panel 1. This panel has some odd framing, but I still like it. The amount of space I dedicate to the black spot of receding deep tunnel on this page helps to play off of Sadie's remark. Are there other creatures down here? Saxon's cloak bottom being the only visual clue that he's continuing to try and scale the wall is also a strange choice, but I like that there are foreground mice either side of the tunnel dark to help frame and add a sense of depth. Panels 2 and 3. The outline description for this page and the next read as Dark Heather Rune. Kellinaw is the one to spot the tile work that implies that this could be part of the weasel home known as Dark Heather. The painted emblem is of an armed weasel crowned by a stylized flower of heather. The weasel tunnels are known by the name Dark Heather because of their lush covering of heather around the entrance. With this being winter, I couldn't show that plant, and frankly, as the mice aren't aware of this being a dark heather entrance, it shouldn't be marked by the flower. The motif of that stylized flower is one that I carried all throughout Dark Heather when I show it later in this issue as part of their tile work. Panel 4. And the last beat on this page is of Saxon stating the obvious for the reader, but also giving them a sense of who is the most upset and triggered by this information. It doesn't come up until later, but Saxon is one of the few mice who ever entered Dark Heather and returned alive from it. Page 7, panel 1. Even though as the storyteller, I knew I was going to split the party, I needed the mice to exhaust the options of them reuniting here on the surface. Saxon is still attempting to climb that tunnel wall. I alternated views showing the mice below in panels 1 and 3 with this panel of the mice above. The escape rope Kellinaw has fashioned of his axe wrap in the bindings. Oh, perhaps this is why I had the cloak blow off a few pages back. I'm not sure anymore. It seems pretty feeble anyhow, and something he should know better than to try. A note on guards mice. I use that term throughout fall and winter, but more recently like the sound of guard mice better. Mice is already plural, and making both words plural sounds odd to me now. Panel 3. As Saxon tumbles in the background, Sadie, who didn't have quite as active a role in the Weasel War, or she didn't in my mind at the time I wrote Winter, was the right mouse to ask the question that I wanted Kenzie to answer for the reader. Dark Heather, if you look at the map of the territories, is southwest and beyond the scent border. Kenzie is confused because the mice know that they are not only inside the territory borders, but far enough in to be beyond some mouse settlements. For myself, to help explain this tunnel with logic and history, I had the idea that the weasels tried a massive annexation of any tunnels, burrows, and warrens they could conquer, shoving out and slaying moles, badgers, hares, anything that lived in there. So this may be a conquered but never fully weasel-occupied domain. Panel 4. Remember how feeble I said that rescue rope of Kellinaw's was? Come on, Black Axe Wielder. You should have known better. But I needed to quickly exhaust this option of vertical escape, so Saxon and Kenzie tell us all we need to know, if it wasn't already visually clear. Page 8, panels 1 and 2. Somewhere, perhaps in an inner pocket of Kenzie's cloaks, he apparently keeps a sliver of flint, and combined with the steel fragments of Saxon's sword and some dry grass, he can relight the font of his lantern. Though it's only 2 panels, I knew I wanted to show some methodology in Winter and draw from some Jack London stories, and my background as a Boy Scout who went on many a winter camping trip. Panel 2. In case it's not clear, the word balloon coming from below panel is Kenzie. Kenzie the planner. As Kellinaw gives the directional reference to Kenzie, Liam has one of those non-verbal reactions indicated visually by his dot-eye expression and the lines coming off of his face. He is shocked by what he realizes is being suggested here. Panel 3. That navigational coincidence sure is convenient. It also doesn't quite work geographically. When they find major locations of Dark Heather even further north and east of where I said Dark Heather should be. Oh well. I guess the mice just didn't really understand where Dark Heather was since it was underground. Liam is almost so anxious in this panel, he seems to be leaning far enough over that hole to tumble down in. Panel 4. And Kenzie announces the decision to split the parties, as Saxon belts his scabbard back on, and Sadie readies her hood. Page 9. A splash page to try to impart the impact of the size of this decision. 3 tiny mice going into a dark oblivion that could be connected to their species' hell on Earth. I based the shading and feel of the receding tunnel on a photo of a rabbit warren entrance. I also remember looking at an etching of Mortimer's hole from Nottingham Castle as an inspiration for rendering a cave. Page 10, Panel 1. Back above ground, Liam is shocked and indignant at the idea of splitting up, but Kellenau calmly has no qualms about it as he lights his pipe, something I didn't take time to show how it was done, but left the implication of him using the tools he's re-securing in his belt pouch. I wanted in Kellenau's dialogue here the idea of giving him a counter-philosophy from Midnight, that Kellenau is working for a greater good. But when it comes down to it, I suppose that was what Midnight thought he was after as well. More on that later in the issue. Panel 2. Here Kellenau uses that greater good term, and he sounds a bit harsh, suggesting Liam wasn't worth Saxon and Kenzie's efforts. And while there is some truth to having to weigh what was at stake for the entire territories versus finding Liam, he isn't wholly wrong. Panel 3. And Liam brings up the no brother left behind argument. And I feel not that he's so much arguing on his own behalf over the events of Fall, but on Saxon, Kenzie, and Sadie's behalf right now. That he's looking back over his shoulder at the whole is even meant to imply that more. I think there is a tradition of mentors not living up to initial expectations and giving counterintuitive lessons at the start. This exchange was supposed to get the Liam and Kellenau relationship off on that type of beginning. Panel 4. To soften Kellenau's view up a little, I decided to add in this dialogue, so his idea is also to help the ones most in need, and allow the ones who have a better chance of helping themselves to do so, while the lesser able need aid. The branch and grass in this panel were inspired by one of the photos I'd taken the previous winter in preparation for this series, of landscape up close and low to the ground. Though Kellenau being up on that branch makes no real sense tactically, it helps visually make the scene more interesting. Page 11. This page is a mirror of the panel layout on the previous page. Panel 1. It was time for a pullback establishing shot to both vary the types of panels and the winter visuals, but also to give a sense of scale. Though honestly it's a bit fudged here, as those mice are either quite large, or that tree isn't nearly as big as it should be. Kellenau is giving a tip to the reader in the dialogue that in addition to the obvious observation that Saxon and Kenzie bicker, that Sadie is preoccupied with Kenzie, a hint at a relationship that will bloom, or bloom as well as I could do at this stage in my storytelling career. Panel 2. While all the panels on this page were inspired by photos of winter scenes, this and the next panel are the only ones I took myself. This one is of our front oak tree, and the decorative plants that get reduced to dry spindles trapping frozen fall leaves under a blanket of snow. I cut Liam's dialogue off here because I did want him to make the point that he didn't doubt his fellow guard mice, but I also didn't want the debate on leaving them behind to continue. So Kellenau cuts him off to do some real mentoring. Panel 3. Yes, I did take a photo of the snow from above. I was trying to catch how to subtly show the ridges and wind-cut micro-topography on the snow surface. I think I was a bit too subtle here with it, though. Kellenau is addressing Liam's potential hero worship of his previous mentors. He's asking a question that seems an obvious one to answer, that of course Liam would love to be a guard mouse as accomplished and skilled as they are. Panel 4. But in true mentor fashion, Kellenau's answer is much more obvious as a goal as anyone should have in any field. The way this panel lines up with panel 1 was an accident as I was playing with the photo references in my layout stage. The two images were different places, but the edge of the snow lined up so closely that I decided to take advantage of it and show that the mice have only traveled that far between the start and end of the page, overlooking a valley meant to be a metaphor for Liam's journey to become his own mouse. Page 12, panels 1 through 3. To break up the talking heads and passive nature scenes, I opted to overlay Kellenaw's dialogue over a scene of the pair finding predator tracks, following them prepared to do battle, finding a bloody carcass. The scenes don't really have anything directly to do with the narration, save for the idea that Saxon being reckless into action and Kenzie being passive ties into following these prints and then opting to change route after the bloody discovery. But unfortunately, the dialogue is mismatched with those panels. I also never meant to resolve the what or who of the carcass or the prints, only to show that there was danger beyond the weather, without having to do a whole predator encounter scene. Panel 4. This establishing shot of a creek with some ice, but flowing enough to have not frozen over entirely, was purely set up for the next page, as Kellenaw wrapped up his view of Kenzie in the Saxon-Kenzie equation. I also made sure to use his as a pronoun for Kenzie, because I'd apparently never made it clear that Kenzie was a male in the comic, and while it seemed obvious to me, some fans had thought Kenzie was female. This was dialogue written in such a way as to course correct based on fan feedback. Page 13. The idea of showing a scene unrelated to the narration continues here over 6 panels. This is something I was trying for the first time in Mouseguard in an effort to double up what I could pack into a scene, what the dialogue narration says, and what is being seen. I grew up with a creek at the end of my street that meandered as a border in my neighborhood between the residential areas and a golf course and nature park. Every winter, I'd walk the frozen over creek, in all conditions, frozen over solid, some open water flows, or snow-capped exposed rocks with no ice in sight. And almost every winter, under each of those conditions, I'd end up going through the ice and getting a freezing cold, wet pant leg or two. This scene is a direct reference to that childhood experience. Kellenaw is explaining how he believes he tested and manipulated Kenzie back in issue 1, and is using it as an object lesson for what I think is Kellenaw already prepping and testing Liam to be the next Black Axe, a mouse destined to solitude. Page 14, panels 1 and 2. While I was always close enough to home on my iced creek exploits to remove wet clothes and get warm and dry at home, Liam and Kellenaw need to stop and do a quick fire to warm Liam up and dry out his cloak. Worried about how a wet cloak might drape over the axe, I cut a swatch of fabric, soaked it in water, and put it over a scale model of the Black Axe I'd made in my dad's shop, a model later referenced for scale and details, and then improved upon by Skeleton Crew Studios. I loved pushing the idea of Kellenaw as a mystic, knowing the unknowable, because it's whispered between the birds and beasts of the territories, making Kellenaw a multilingual mouse who uses all species as a natural telegraph network. Panel 3. I planned this panel to match up with panel 1 on the next page, as the weather turns from slow to sleet or freezing rain. Liam is plowing snow over the fire with his acorn-capped snowshoe. I guess he's already made the decision that they are going to press on, something he doesn't vocalize until the next page. To ink the freezing rain on the overlay sheet, I clumsily used a brush instead of the cotton swab I used to make the snow dots, to get something that looked more solid and frozen than rain, but still wetter than snow. Page 15. This page is a 180-degree rotation of the previous page's layout. Panel 1. As I said, this is the companion panel to the last panel on page 14. Kellenaw has to explain to the reader some of the finer details of the weather effects, something that is hard to show, so I opted to have him tell it instead. Panel 2. The fire is extinguished. Perhaps it was also due to this rain and not just Liam's feet, as Liam recites back Kellenaw's words to him. The overhead shot was a way to switch up the camera angle and to fit both characters and all their dialogue in. Panel 3. In the last panel of this scene, Kellenaw verbalizes what part of my intent as a storyteller was for this entire series. Perhaps he's just acknowledging the fact that Liam is now also aware and on board for the training. The icicles forming in Kellenaw's fur around his muzzle are inspired by scenes from Dr. Zhivago, and something I amp up visually in the next issue. The inks for the icicles are on the original art with Kellanaw in the background, and not on the overlay sheet with the falling ice rain. When it came time to color this page, I had to go in and isolate any of the icicle line art and paint it white to get the effect. Page 16, panel 1. A scene change! We find ourselves catching up with our subterranean party of mice. To help make the transitions obvious, I always tried to make sure the Dark Heather scenes were much darker than where Liam and Kellanaw were. Kenzie is narrating as much to the audience as he is to his patrol. I needed them to be getting further underground the ground's surface to accommodate all that Dark Heather had to be, and I thought having them dip below a frost line would be a great indication of how deep they've gone. Here in Michigan, that gets them about 4 to 5 feet underground, a long way for a mouse. The fragments of tile work I thought would be a great way to show a slow build-up to Weasel architecture, while also implying disrepair and a fallen civilization. The pattern was based on me doing modular designs of hexagonal patterns, something that I learned and always stuck with me from my two-dimensional design class in my first semester of college. I've done a blog post about it, where I called it one of the most important classes I ever took. Panel 2. With the setting getting warmer, I used it as an opportunity for Saxon to shed his overcloak. The gray was meant to mute him down from sticking out in red on the snow, having only his red tie off and the underside of his red exposed like a lining. Now, I could get back to the visuals of him in red to help make it obvious which brown fur is Saxon and which is Sadie, as we get into lower light settings. Saxon voices what seems logical, to regroup with the others and not head further underground, or towards any potential weasels. Keep in mind, Saxon has been here before, though it's not revealed until a few issues from now. Panel 3. Kenzie now explains his new plan. This was because I had to justify to myself that they'd take this route through Dark Heather. In some ways, Dark Heather is meant to be the Mines of Moria as a safer route, but I've also described them going through here as like a Polish Jew going through Auschwitz as a shortcut in the late 1940s. So investigating that there isn't an active Weasel Kingdom right under Mouse Cities seems enough reason to at least scout ahead. After 2 medium shot panels, and knowing I was going to have another as the 4th, I opted here to pull back a bit, change up the view, and remind the reader of the sense of scale, and to make room for that chunk of dialogue. Panel 4. This panel breaks the rule of trying to have the characters going forward, moving from left to right. That the reverse, as I have it here, suggests backtracking or returning. I'm not sure if I did that because technically they are returning in the direction of home, albeit underground and towards a weasel ruin, or because I wanted them to feel like they are in a bit of a maze going wherever the tunnel leads. Or if it was because Saxon's dialogue was first, so having him on the left made the most sense. Saxon and Kenzie bicker about the safe return of goods to Lockhaven, an example of their both agreeing on the end goal but having very different opinions on how to get there, or which mice will literally get it there. Guard's sake was an attempt to craft an in-world, Lord's name in vain type phrase, though I was never sold enough to use it again. Page 17, panel 1. As the trio approaches the gates, they use the fragments of tile off the walls to hide behind. I think I was channeling some of the Scarecrow, Tin Woodsman, and Cowardly Lion, hiding on the rocks watching the witch's castle in The Wizard of Oz. To help soften the pattern of the tile and make it look like art on the surface of those ruins, I did color holds on all of the designs, but not the fragment edges themselves. I remember it being tedious and being already sick of those patterns, just after a few panels. Panel 2. The Gates to Dark Heather. Seems like a good time to talk about Weasel architecture influences. I'd always imagined the Weasel motifs to be very Norse before doing this issue. Norwegian stave churches, Russian wooden peasant structures, even some medieval Japanese temple influence. Unfortunately, when I was going to the bookstore for books on those styles of architecture, I could find nothing. This is back when bookstores were my main source of purchasing and finding books. And with what I did find, it seemed like so much of the character of that architecture was in the roof structures.
and they would be really hard to reimagine as a tunnel-dwelling architectural motif. I did find a book on Moorish architecture, though, and I saw all the tile work, the pillars, the detail and designs of the ceilings, not the roofs, the ceilings, and instantly shifted dark heather in that direction. Unfortunately, that implies a parallel, that because the weasels are the villains of the mice, that I've now associated Moorish architecture and Islamic motifs to be villainous, and that was never my intent. I only wanted something visually interesting and architectural to work underground, while also looking foreign enough from my very English-looking mouse society that readers and mice alike would know this is a different culture. As Mouseguard goes on, I do intend to try to make it clear that weasels are not evil, and therefore, neither should things associated with them be automatically seen as evil either, just different. The room here in this panel is very heavily based on part of the Alcazar of Seville in Spain. The gates themselves were from an architectural antiques site, not the store I worked for though. And the figures left and right of the gates were my earliest sketches of dark heather weasels, shrunk down and mirrored once I had the Moorish motif established. Page 18, Panel 1. Saxon is reminded of old times, referencing the Weasel War a few years prior to this, and is ready to leap before he looks. Panel 2, and before he has Kenzie on board. Also, with only the fragment of a sword left as his weapon. Panel 3. The action panel is from the Weasel's perspective, or, as the clank indicates, the would-be Weasel. Panel 4. The outline for these pages simply has 2 pages dedicated to Saxon attacking a statue. I'd hoped that the visual was enough to sell that this isn't a living creature, but as I said, a statue. Saxon's reaction was meant to also help sell that idea. Page 19. This page's panel layout is a mirror of the last page. Panel 1. The dialogue here was not only to cement to the reader and the characters that the weasel is a statue, but also shows how aggressive Saxon is at covering up his errors, deflecting that it was Kenzie who was worried and not Saxon. And again, in the background, all the tile pattern was isolated as a color hold. Panel 2. I tried to get in some good pose acting here for Saxon and Kenzie as they argue. While Kenzie is right about how aggressively foolish that charge and attack was, I like Saxon's point that he sees that Sadie and Kenzie should have been able to hold up the same workload that he was capable of. It shows that Saxon expects more of himself than the others, which is a double-edged position to have, to always expect the best from yourself and to try to do more than your neighbor, but while also automatically assuming that no one else can live up to what you contribute. Call back to Sadie's cracking shot from issue 1 and the way Kenzie complimented her on it, as well as a call forward to Saxon calling Kenzie's staff and lantern combo a basket of fire. Panel 3. An overhead shot to switch up the view and to really show Saxon and Kenzie squaring off, reminiscent of the scene they refer to here in the dialogue from Fall issue or chapter 3. It's hard to see, but the lump hanging from the belt of the weasel is meant to be a mouse corpse tied by the tail as part of the statue. It's something I wanted to show as a way of explaining how horrific the idea of weasel culture is to the mice, especially after the war, but that I made it a bit more subtle so as to try not to hit anyone over the head with something too gruesome. Panel 4. Kenzie doesn't remember Saxon's Barkstone plan as being very successful. While it did buy Liam some time and ultimately and indirectly led Saxon and Kenzie to Kellinaw, I think we can side with Kenzie that it wasn't the best of plans. Sadie tries to redirect the conversation by checking the gates and finding them to be unlocked, and the next passage to be weasel-free. Page 20, Panel 1. The architecture on this page is from the Great Mosque of Cordova, and this panel in particular was meant to be very reminiscent of the Fellowship traveling through Moria. For the remaining architecture of this issue, I found myself pretty much tracing the geometry of locations from photographs and then inking them in my style with textures and patterns, lighting them for the scene. But in later issues, I found myself needing better options for scenes in the same rooms. I'll cover those in later commentary for those issues. Panel 2. The conversation continues about the mystery of this place. Not only why is it this far north, but also why was none of it destroyed in the war? A question I don't plan on answering until I get to the end of the volume called The Weasel War of 1149. Panel 3. To try and get more weasel aesthetics into existing architecture, I used the stylized heather flower on the tile, but also made a repeating pattern of weasels, like a frieze or wallpaper border, to replace the very specific Islamic imagery. I tried to make it clear that the scale here is larger than mouse-sized, and the stairs are a bit too tall for Saxon to walk up, and instead, he needs to climb a bit. Page 21, Panel 1. This ceiling and gallery, as well as the stairwell opening on the last page, are based on the Aljafria in Saragossa. Note the hexagonal heather motif in the center of the ceiling. And Saxon's reference to ghosts could mean both mice who died in the war, as well as the weasels. Panels 2 through 4. 3 quick reaction shots as the party hears something ahead. Even though the backgrounds line up in a way that this is all essentially one wide panel, I opted to add in the gutters between, so they each read as separate beats. I wanted Sadie to get the role of rogue or spy in this party. She's the one who hears something. Kenzie leads by reinforcing Sadie should be the sly scout, and Saxon is getting irritated and perhaps jealous of being a third wheel here. I don't love this dialogue for Saxon, though. The use of the word tactics and merit feel like they were part of some other conversation we didn't get to see or were edited out of a longer script, and they weren't. While Saxon is meant to be overreacting, it seems heavier-handed when the specifics he uses feel like they come out of nowhere. Page 22, Panel 1. I guess Saxon's objection allowed him to push ahead, not only of Kenzie, but also of Sadie, who is supposed to be scouting ahead. Whoops. Saxon's dialogue in this panel being incomplete and finishing in Panel 3 was an idea I had as I was laying out the page. By ending Saxon's line on Dark Heather, Panel 2, I was able to give the bats a voice, not just a noise. Sadie could have heard bats breathing or rustling, or perhaps they were already echoing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I realized when laying out this page that a beat between the mice and then the reveal in Panel 3 meant that I could show a close-up of a bat, and that was an opportunity to give the bats a voice as a species. I didn't want to just have a different font for them, but a different speech pattern, and since real bats use echoes as part of their navigation, I thought having them echo the mice and each other would make for something really unique and something really creepy. Panel 3. And the reveal to the reader that Dark Heather is full of bats, as Saxon continues his solve all problems of actions with swords. Page 23, Panel 1. As I mentioned in the last commentary track, I didn't label the apothecary properly in the last issue, and since in this issue the transition in scene wasn't just one place in Lockhaven to another, but rather Dark Heather to Lockhaven, I felt the need to make a sign. I'm not sure what I based it on. I don't seem to have a reference photo or scan of any hanging sign like that, but I'm sure I had some reference for it. Panel 2. The extreme overhead view of the apothecary was meant to show that other than Gwendolyn and Rand, it's empty. Abigail is not there. Panel 3. Rand is able to whisper why he hasn't recovered. Panels 4 and 5. And here Gwendolyn confirms it. I'd almost wished I'd switched the order of these two panels, but I think the impact of Gwendolyn saying it after the reader seeing the botanical entry would have been overkill. I wrote in the poison angle for Rand's illness, not only to create the drama at home for the mice, but also to make sure that if the party couldn't make it home with the medicine they thought Rand would need, based on Abigail's information, Rand could still survive, that getting him away from his poisoner could be cure enough. I mocked up the 2 exposed pages of the botanical guide, and then I printed them out and laid them into the middle of a thick book splayed open. That way I could photograph it and trace the text and imagery as it followed the curve and perspective of an open-bound book. Pin-up by Stan Sakai. Stan had expressed interest in doing a Mouse Guard Usagi Yojimbo pin-up swap when we met at the previous year's San Diego Comic-Con. He wanted to check to make sure that it was okay to include Usagi in his Mouse Guard piece. I said it was, as long as he was okay with me not including my mice in my Usagi piece. Stan did the color in vibrant watercolors. When he gifted me the original artwork, which is stunning, he told me that he had no idea how to make the scale work with the size discrepancies between our two characters' worlds, but just embraced it and shrunk down Usagi as he and Sadie battle underwater one of Stan's favorite parts of fall, the crabs. And that's the second issue of Mouse Guard Winter 1152. It has been collected in a hardcover published by Archaea. If you've enjoyed this commentary, please leave comments in the section below. Let me know what I didn't answer for you in this issue, and subscribe for updates when I add more Mouse Guard commentary. Thank you for listening.